Recently, Hello Games finally ported No Man's Sky to Mac. Today, we're going to have an in-depth look at how the game has been built for modern Macs and its performance across 7 different Apple Silicon Mac models. The Mac port includes almost all of the same content as PC and console, with all the new major updates added since launch. I'm so happy No Man's Sky has been brought to Steam too. This is one of the biggest gaming storefronts and has much better features over gaming through the App Store. Hello Games have confirmed they will be releasing the game on the App Store at some point in the future, which I also hope comes with the iPad version. I don't know where that version is. Cross-save is supported between Windows, PC, and Mac. Crossplay is supported too, allowing players to join other existing players on Xbox One, Xbox Series S and X, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, PC, and even VR. Another small feature is controller support. I always like to go over controller support as it's often either left out or poorly implemented on Mac. While it's unfortunate it doesn't support next-gen controller features such as DualSense adaptive triggers, overall controller support works fine here, and it also has rumble vibration. What's missing right now is the VR mode. Who knows, this may be added in a future update with Apple's new Apple Vision Pro, just announced at WWDC 2023. Now let's go over the tech that has been implemented into No Man's Sky for Mac. No Man's Sky runs entirely on the Metal framework. No other translation layer has been used, for example, Molten VK. The game is written using the C++ language and uses a customized version of the Forge Confetti FX engine. All this is great to see. However, based on my resource digging into the game's files, I don't believe this game runs on Metal 3. Let me explain. The game supports both macOS Ventura 13 and macOS Monterey 12. Metal 3 is exclusive to macOS Ventura 13. If an app or game supports anything lower than Ventura, it needs fairly sophisticated insights to pick correct Metal features on each platform. Most likely means No Man's Sky on Mac uses anywhere from Metal 2.1 to Metal 2.4. But wait, you might be saying, the game uses MetalFX upscaling, which is a part of Metal 3, right? No. MetalFX is a separate framework. MetalFX is only limited to macOS Ventura 13. The MetalFX framework integrates with Metal to upscale a relatively low-resolution image to a higher output resolution in less time than it takes to render directly to the output resolution. MetalFX gives you 2 different ways to upscale your input renderings: temporal anti-aliased upscaling and spatial upscaling. No Man's Sky supports both these input renderings in settings. If you have an Intel Mac, only spatial upscaling is supported. Spatial upscaling provides high image quality with improved frame rates. It's very similar to AMD FSR 1.0. Temporal upscaling uses information from multiple frames to provide the best image quality at a higher computational cost than spatial upscaling. MetalFX also includes 4 modes, which upscale the internal resolution up to your target resolution. A developer can adjust the scaling percentages. I analyzed the game using Terminal and found the scaling percentages that No Man's Sky uses. Performance applies 2 times scaling. Balanced applies 1.6 times scaling. Quality applies 1.5 times scaling, and Ultra Quality provides 1.3 times scaling. This is the same for either spatial or temporal. For example, I'm using an M2 Mac Mini. Here Is the game running at 1080p high graphical quality with VSync disabled and anti-aliased disabled, i.e. no MetalFX? The average FPS in this scene is 60 FPS. Let's see how different MetalFX settings affect performance. With MetalFX Spatial and Performance, the FPS is 105. Balanced, it goes down to 93. Quality, it goes down to 81. And Ultra Quality, it goes down to 72. MetalFX Temporal and Performance, we're seeing 87 FPS. Balanced, it is now 79 FPS. Quality, it is down to 73 FPS. And Ultra Quality, 63 FPS. As you can see, MetalFX Spatial has a much better improvement with FPS over Temporal. That being said, Spatial upscaling looks very ugly, especially at 1080p and lower resolutions, with overall blurriness and a considerably worse image quality. While Temporal upscaling sees more expensive results, it looks considerably better. The shimmering is mostly removed, and the image quality is more clear thanks to the resolutions being higher. Higher modes such as quality or ultra quality within temporal upscaling don't look too different to the game running at native resolution too. The most disappointing aspect of this Mac port is the absence of HDR. HDR is available for the game on Windows PC and console, so why is it not here? Hello Games. On Mac, Apple use EDR. It's been supported on Mac since macOS Catalina. Doing good HDR is a big thing on Mac. It makes absolutely no sense why it's not here, and I'm very disappointed. Now let's look at the performance across a range of Macs. To showcase average performance on Mac, I have tested the game across 5 locations in the game. This is for 3 planets, a small space combat sequence, and inside a space station. Keep in mind, I'm not that familiar with what people want to see in this game. This is really the first time I've actually played No Man's Sky. First, let's start with the Apple M1 chip. Pause the video now for the specs of my M1 based Macs. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080. Enhanced settings with VSync disabled, the FPS is on 240 and anti-aliasing is disabled. Or you can see the exact settings on screen now. My M1 13-inch MacBook Pro sees 55 FPS on average, uses 5.25 GB of RAM, uses 208.46% of the CPU 2 cores, and 99.3% of the GPU on average. My M1 iMac sees 55.6 FPS on average, uses 6.24 GB of RAM, uses 225.38% of the CPU 2 cores, and 99.14% of the GPU on average. 55 FPS might sound good on paper, but keep in mind the FPS will drop dramatically in some challenging scenes. In particular, when exploring planets with lush environments, going down into the 40s or even the 20s. Exploring space I found was fine though, with typically well over 60 FPS. It can drop though if you engage in big combat sequences. It's also good to see the game doesn't really use much over 6 GB of memory. What if you want to play at a slightly higher resolution and graphical quality? This is possible, but you'll have to accept 30 FPS. Pause the video now to see the settings I'm using on my 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro to achieve this performance. This is 2048 by 1152 resolution. VSync is on, triple buffered, a 30 FPS cap, mostly high settings, and anti-aliasing on MetalFX Temporal, and MetalFX Quality is on balanced. My device sees 29.2 FPS on average, uses 5.7 GB of RAM, uses 167.06% of the CPU and 73.14% of the GPU. Temporal anti-aliasing looks decent at this high resolution, and being able to play at high settings is great. 30 FPS is also, in my opinion, completely playable for this game. Now pause the video to see the settings I'm using on my M1 iMac to achieve this 30 FPS target. This is the same graphical settings, but the resolution is at 2560 by 1440. This iMac sees 28.8 FPS on average, uses 7.15% of RAM, 168.32% of the CPU, and 82.74% of the GPU. This iMac has considerably better thermal management than my 13-inch MacBook Pro. This means it has slightly better performance and could play at a high resolution for the 30 FPS target. What if you want closer to 60 FPS? This is possible using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 1080p, VSync is on triple buffered, a 60 FPS cap, a mix of standard, enhanced, and high settings, and anti-aliasing is on MetalFX temporal, and MetalFX quality is on balanced. My M1 13-inch MacBook Pro sees 54.2 FPS on average, uses 5.7 GB of RAM, uses 226.26% of the CPU, 2 cores, and 84.54% of the GPU on average. My M1 iMac sees 55 FPS on average, uses 6.924 GB of RAM, uses 241.42% of the CPU, 2 cores, and 86.94% of the GPU on average. MetalFX Spatial doesn't look amazing, I'll be honest, but honestly these were the best settings I could find to reach up to 60 FPS more frequently. A locked 60 FPS is not possible in M1 at a reasonably high resolution. Overall, M1 performance is fine, you can get by quite easily. That is if you don't mind a 30 FPS target. These M1 chips are not, they're not incredibly powerful, so you cannot expect miracles on them. Besides, most flagship titles on pure M1 are only really playable at 30 FPS. Anyway, so this performance is to be expected. If you've played this game on 8th gen consoles, it's very similar, or even Switch. The one thing I'll note, and this will come up for every device, Hello Games need to profile the jetpack launching animation so the frame rate doesn't drop so dramatically. It's game breaking if you are targeting over 30 FPS, especially on M1. Now let's look at Apple M2. Pause the video now for the specs of my M2 based Macs. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080. Enhanced settings with VSync disabled, FPS is on 240 and anti-aliasing is disabled, or you can see the exact settings on screen now. My M2 13-inch MacBook Pro sees 65 FPS on average, uses 5.2 GB of RAM, uses 246.58% of the CPU, 2 cores, and 99.34% of the GPU on average. My M2 Mac Mini sees 68 FPS on average, uses 6.1 GB of RAM, uses 238.28% of the CPU, 2 cores, and 97.22% of the GPU on average. The performance is quite a bit better than M1 with about plus 10 FPS. Obviously there are still some scenes where the FPS will tank, but unlike M1 it doesn't go below 30 FPS in the worst case scenario, which is ideal. It can also go quite a bit over 100 FPS in space, which is cool, but will drop during combat. The RAM usage doesn't really go much above 6 GB too. What if you want to play at a slightly higher resolution and graphical quality? This is possible, but you'll have to accept 30 FPS. Pause the video now to see the settings I'm using on my 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro to achieve this performance. This is 2048 by 1152 resolution. VSync is on triple buffered, a 30 FPS cap, high settings, and anti-aliasing is on MetalFX temporal, and MetalFX quality is on quality. My device sees 29 FPS on average, uses 5.8 GB of RAM, 189.1% of the CPU, it almost saturates 2 cores, and 65.16% of the GPU. Unlike my M1 13-inch MacBook Pro, these settings are quite a bit higher and the game doesn't struggle as much in those challenging scenes. Frame pacing is also better overall, which is ideal for a more consistent experience. Now, pause the video to see the settings I'm using on my M2 Mac Mini to achieve this performance. This is 2560 by 1440 resolution, VSync is on triple buffered, 30 FPS cap, high settings, and anti-aliasing is on MetalFX temporal, and MetalFX quality is on quality. My device sees 29.3 FPS on average, uses 7.1 GB of RAM, 175.02% of the CPU, it almost saturates 2 cores, and 78.88% of the GPU. The Mac Mini has dramatically better thermal management, so it's able to play at 1440p pretty comfortably without throttling as much. Playing at slightly higher resolution also means the scaling of MetalFX is less apparent. What if you want to play at near 60 FPS but still at higher quality settings? This is possible using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 1080p, VSync is on, triple buffered, a 60 FPS cap, a mix of enhanced and high settings, and anti-aliasing is on MetalFX temporal, and MetalFX quality is on balanced. My M2 13-inch MacBook Pro sees 54.4 FPS on average, uses 5.7 GB of RAM, uses 189.1% of the CPU, almost saturates 2 cores, and 78.14% of the GPU on average. My M2 Mac Mini sees 56.7 FPS on average, uses 6.8 GB of RAM, uses 216.64% of the CPU, 2 cores, and 89.12% of the GPU on average. Keep in mind it's not locked to 60 FPS, it will drop to 45 FPS or sometimes lower on the odd occasion. This is the best settings I could find for close to 60 FPS on my machines. I can't guarantee it for you. MetalFX being on temporal seriously helps improve the image quality compared to M1, which was on spatial for its, well, custom 60 FPS settings. Overall, I'm very happy with the M2 performance. It's quite a bit better than M1. Achieving a high FPS above 30 can be a little challenging still, so you will have to lower settings a bit, but MetalFX does help with that for sure. There is also still that annoying FPS bug with the jetpack. The FPS drops dramatically, no matter the settings. Moving on, let's take a look at Apple M1 Pro. Pause the video now for the specs of my M1 Pro based Mac. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080. Enhanced settings with VSync disabled, FPS is on 240, and anti-aliasing is disabled. Or you can see the exact settings on screen now. My M1 Pro 14-inch MacBook Pro sees 83.6 FPS on average, uses 6 GB of RAM, uses 245.36% of the CPU, 2 cores, and 98.88% of the GPU on average. The performance is wonderful in this state and typically well over 60 FPS. Again, lush planets can drop the FPS quite a bit, but it's nowhere near as bad as pure M1 or M2. I'd go as far to say I think most of you will enjoy playing this game. The resolution is decent enough, and having no MetalFX enabled means there will be no upscaling or a worse quality image, and the frame rate is good. It's up to you. What if you want to play at a much higher resolution and graphical quality? This is possible, but you'll need to accept 30 FPS and use my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 3360 by 1890 resolution. VSync is on triple buffered, a 30 FPS cap, high settings, and anti-aliasing is on MetalFX temporal, and MetalFX quality is on quality. My device sees 29.46 FPS on average, uses 7.38GB of RAM, 170.72% of the CPU, it almost saturates 2 cores, and 84.96% of the GPU. Playing at a much higher resolution and high settings on this device is a real treat. You can really appreciate the details of all the worlds on offer in this game. The thermal management on my 14-inch MacBook Pro is not amazing, so that is why only shadows are on enhanced to reduce overheating. Only by a touch though. What if you want to play at near 60 FPS but still at high quality settings? This is possible using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 2560 by 1440, VSync is on triple buffered, a 60 FPS cap, a mix of enhanced and high settings, and anti-aliasing is on MetalFX temporal, and MetalFX quality is on balanced. My M1 Pro 14-inch MacBook Pro sees 56.2 FPS on average, uses 7GB of RAM, uses 227.41% of the CPU 2 cores, uses 92.16% of the GPU on average as well. This is my preferred way to play the game on M1 Pro. While MetalFX lowers the image quality a bit, it's still above 1080p and most settings are on high. I'm also impressed that the GPU usage is much higher in this state, as a low GPU usage is often a signal of bad coding in some ways. Overall, I'm once again very happy with the performance here. This is the type of results I would expect from these M1 Pro machines, and this game meets that. M1 Pro is not an overwhelmingly powerful chip or device, but they can push beyond the limits if developers can do it. The only issue that it has still is the jetpack thing where the FPS drops dramatically. It's really annoying. Fix it. Now it's time to look at M1 Max. Pause the video now for the specs of my M1 Max based Mac. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080. Enhanced settings with VSync disabled, FPS is on 240 and anti-aliasing is disabled, or you can see the exact settings on screen now. My M1 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro sees 124 FPS on average, uses 6.2GB of RAM, uses 326.08% of the CPU, 3 cores, and 95.72% of the GPU on average. The performance is pretty great here. Sometimes it can even reach as far as 200 FPS, but only for a brief moment, so it's not really worth going over. This will also give you an indication of how much more powerful this chip is than M1 Pro, with about plus 40 FPS at these settings. It should also show you that you can play at much higher settings than this. For example, you can choose a 4K resolution with a high FPS using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 3840 by 2160 4K resolution. VSync is on triple buffered, a 60 FPS cap, mostly high settings with shadows on enhanced and anti-aliasing on MetalFX temporal, and MetalFX quality is on quality. My device sees 56.3 FPS on average, uses 7.8GB of RAM, 243.5% of the CPU 2 cores, and 95.48% of the GPU. It would have been nice if you could more easily put MetalFX quality to ultra quality, but I found the FPS jumps down too much. Anyway, I think these settings are quite wonderful, and you get to experience the game in its full glory mostly, with some minor sacrifices such as shadows on enhanced. What if you want to play above 60 FPS on this device? It is possible using my on-screen recommended settings now. 2560 by 1440 resolution, VSync is off, FPS is on 240, a mix of high, enhanced, and standard settings, and anti-aliasing on MetalFX spatial, and MetalFX quality is on balanced. My device sees 100.4 FPS on average, uses 7.1 GB of RAM, 307.8% of the CPU, 3 cores, and 90.68% of the GPU. As you can see, you have to play at lower quality settings and use MetalFX spatial, which is not preferred. However, since the resolution target is 1440p, the internal resolution isn't dramatically reduced below 1080p. Look, it's up to you if you want to play the game in this state. I wouldn't, but you might appreciate the high FPS if you have a high refresh rate monitor. Overall, I'm very impressed with the performance here on M1 Max. That being said, this isn't the most demanding game of all time, so it's expected to see this. Now it's time to look at M2 Max. Pause the video now for the specs of my M2 Max based Mac. Let's see how the game plays at 1920 by 1080. Enhanced settings with VSync disabled, FPS is on 240, and anti-aliasing is disabled, or you can see the exact settings on screen now. My M2 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro sees 167 FPS on average, uses 6.2 GB of RAM, uses 324.76% of the CPU 3 cores, and 92.6% of the GPU on average. Great. It's great. And surprisingly, quite a bit better with performance than M1 Max. Obviously, you can go higher than these settings. I'm just doing 1080p medium to compare different Mac models for you. For example, you can choose a 4K resolution with a high FPS using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 3840 by 2160 resolution. VSync is on triple buffered, a 60 FPS cap, high and ultra settings, and anti-aliasing is on MetalFX temporal, and MetalFX quality is on quality. My device sees 56.3 FPS on average, uses 9.4 GB of RAM, 258.56% of the CPU 2 cores, and 88.28% of the GPU. These settings use over 10 GB of RAM, but it obviously doesn't matter. Also, textures and planet quality on Ultra makes the game look a bit nicer to the eyes. I still struggled to use MetalFX on Ultra quality, but at the same time this may just be because I have some settings on Ultra. Anyway, the game runs very well in this state. What if you want to play above 60 FPS on this device? It is possible using my on-screen recommended settings now. This is 2560 by 1440 resolution. VSync is off, FPS is on 240, high settings and anti-aliasing on MetalFX spatial, and MetalFX quality is on quality. My device sees 108.1 FPS on average, uses 7 GB of RAM, 316.68% of the CPU 3 cores, and 82.78% of the GPU. Unlike M1 Max, you are playing at high quality settings, and while MetalFX spatial is being used, it's also on quality mode. The output image looks decent enough, I suppose. I could not get the GPU to take over 90% of the GPU, which was weird as well. I don't know if that's worth mentioning. Overall, again, I'm pretty happy with the results here. There is still that one issue though. The FPS will still tank dramatically when you use the jetpacks. For goodness sake, please fix Hello Games. What do you think of the No Man's Sky Mac port? Are you impressed or disappointed? Have you bought the game, or did you already own it on Steam so then you could just download it? Are you waiting for the App Store version, which might have the iPad version as well? Let me know in the comments. I think this port is pretty good, but we must remember this isn't the most demanding game. After all, it can run on a Switch. There are also some small optimization and weird things missing from the port, which I discussed earlier, but they are quite small overall. Anyway, leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date with everything Mac gaming related. My name is Julian. Thanks for watching.